Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Chris Wright. I'm the founder of the Anti-Communism Action Team. We are an independent grassroots group dedicated to fighting communism at home and abroad. We started in 2013 and have had a couple of hundred of events since then. Now, tonight's program, we're going to hear from, tonight's program is the Communist Takeover of U.S. Schools and what you can do about it. We're going to hear from Alex Newman about the communist pedigree of our government school system. We'll then go to Lilia Slavova, who's a valued member of our guest. Alex is a guest speaker. Lilia is a valued member of our Anti-Communism Speakers Bureau, and she will speak to us about comparing U.S. education today with what she saw in communist Bulgaria, where she lived. We'll then go to questions and answers. At the end of the formal agenda, I will stay on for up until 9:30 Eastern time if anybody wants to hang around and chat. There will be time for questions and answers. Please put your questions in the chat box. There will be no questions from the floor. Okay, we're going to go to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Alex Newman, but all right, well, Alex Newman grew up in Latin America, Europe, and Africa. He has a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Florida. He is senior editor at the New American. He writes on education at the Freedom Project. He is co-author of the book, Crimes of the Educators, How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. He went on a national tour with his entire family in the summer of 2019 to promote homeschooling. So that was quite an adventure. So Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks everybody for being here. About how long do you want me to go, Chris?
Maybe 15 minutes.
You know, I want to start off with, when it comes to the education system, by going to some of the history, because I think that's really the part that's missing from the equation. A lot of people are just now recognizing that we have a problem in the education system. They see critical race theory or they see the sex ed and they're horrified and they say, what's going on? They've hijacked our public school system. And I think it's critical that we understand that the architects of the public school system were communists. And I recognize that's a very serious charge. It's also a charge that's very easy to substantiate with the evidence. And so I'm going to give a very abbreviated history of government schooling. And I want to point out as well that before government education came along, believe it or not, people still had education. In fact, Americans, prior to the advent of government schools, were the most highly educated people on the planet, bar none, not even a close second. They did this without one iota of government involvement in their education. They were more educated than probably any people had been in all of human history. And they were primarily educated at home. Mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, uncles, aunts, and older siblings were in charge of the bulk of education. That's not to say that there were not schools. In fact, all the different denominations had their own schools. There were Lutheran schools and congregational schools, and some communities even had very simple, rudimentary one-room schoolhouses. But these were not government-controlled, government-run institutions like we have today. The education of the masses, if you will, really got a shot in the arm during the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, among others, was a real advocate that everybody needed to be properly educated. But he didn't say then that means the government should run a school system. He said, this is then a job for the parents and for the church. And so that really resulted in the mass proliferation of education to the masses. And that worked very, very well. Again, that's where the roots of our education system in this country come from. The very first Education Act that was ever passed in North America, and a lot of people look at this as the beginning of government education. I think that's a very flawed view. But there was a law passed in the Massachusetts Bay Colony called the Old Deluder Satan Act. And this, contrary to popular belief, did not establish a government school system. In fact, what it did was very simple. The premise of the statute, and they explained it right in there, was that illiterate people cannot read their Bibles, and if people can't read their Bibles, then they're going to be deceived by Satan. Therefore, we have to do away with illiteracy. And so they said to accomplish this task, if you're in a town of sufficient size, the parents should get together and they should pay a teacher, and they should have that teacher make sure that everybody knows how to read and everybody knows their Bibles so that they can't be deceived by Satan. And so some people look at that and say, see, even the Pilgrims and the Puritans had public schools. No, they did not. That's a very far cry from public schools. Looking back in history, the first person that I can really find who seriously advocated and contemplated a government-run education system was actually Plato. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people who want to sound sophisticated and have no idea what Plato actually advocated treat him as if he were some sort of hero. And, even a broken clock is right twice a day. It's not to say that everything Plato wrote was nonsense, but much of it was. And he was an absolute raging totalitarian, and I think that needs to be highlighted. He believed that philosopher kings should lord it over all the rest of us, and he also thought that the rearing of children should be conducted by the state, allegedly for the benefit of the collective. Obviously, that did not take off. That view did not take off. It did not take root anywhere in the world. And so let's fast forward now. Thomas Jefferson was also an advocate of education, and some people point to him as an advocate of public education. But again, that is a very flawed view of what he advocated. He did not believe the government ought to be running schools, but he did believe that communities needed to get together and make sure that there were schools available where everybody could be educated. And again, primarily this for centuries had been handled by churches and by parents. In fact, through virtually all of the history of the Western world of Christendom, certainly for the last 2,000 years, parents handled the bulk of it with some responsibilities delegated to the church. And then fast forwarding from Plato, the first real advocate that we can find of a government school system along the lines of what we have today is actually a self-proclaimed communist. This was before communism was a thing. This was before Karl Marx came on the scene. His name was Robert Owen. He was a Scottish industrialist, and he had gotten into his head the idea that collectivism was better than individualism, that we should dispense with private property rights, that family was unnecessary. In fact, he argued that the influence of the family on the child was negative. He started a communist commune in Indiana called New Harmony, and within 2 years it failed because communism, of course, is ridiculous, right? Getting rid of private property, getting rid of the family is always and everywhere a failure because those are just terrible ideas. Family and private property are like the foundational principles upon which a civilized society is based. And so when he came along and tried this New Harmony colony, it failed very rapidly, and he came away with the idea that the reason it failed was because parents were such a negative influence on their children. He believed that parents were causing the children to become little individualists who were more concerned about their own well-being than the well-being of the collective. And his solution to this, and he advocated this publicly, was for children to be taken from their parents as soon as practical, preferably around 2 to 3 years old, so that they could be raised in collective institutions where they would be taught the virtues of collectivism. Basically, the new Soviet man, a century before the Soviets came along. So obviously, that idea was not very popular. As I mentioned, Americans were the best educated people on the planet at that time. Literacy was nearly universal, especially in the North, but even in the South, excluding the enslaved population. And so there really was no need, right? When he started telling people that the government should educate their children, people were like, "What? Why would we want the government to educate our children? What kind of dumb idea is that?" Right? I mean, you might as well tell them that the government should cook their dinner for them. It didn't make any sense. It was really a silly idea, and so people did not go for that. So to advance this ideology of his, the statist ideology that the government should run our lives, the government should educate children, we should dispense with private property, he wrote a series of essays, and he also formed what a whistleblower would later describe as a secret society for the purpose of advancing this cause of government education. They had two primary immediate goals. One was to promote among the public the idea that the government should take over education. The other was to get men elected to legislatures around the country who would then advocate for this idea of government education. He also wrote a series of essays on this topic, and we have evidence, at least directly from Robert Owen, that these essays ended up in the hands of the Prussian ambassador. The Prussian ambassador took them back to Prussia, and the Prussian dictator then implemented them in Prussia. He ordered his interior minister to set up government schools, and that was the first real experiment in government-controlled education that we can find really in human history. It succeeded in producing, little statists who would be willing to do whatever the Prussian dictator said, including die for the homeland. It did not succeed in producing, highly educated, critically thinking individuals. But this idea really took root in Prussia. Not in America. Now, I mentioned the whistleblower. His name was Orestes Brownson. He actually wrote a whole book about this and exposing the secret society. He said it was modeled on the Carbonari in Italy. And he said he knew of this, of the operations of the secret society because he was involved in it. In fact, he said he organized a large portion of New York for the work of the secret society. Now, after it took root in Prussia, a number of liberal utopians here in the United States, including the factions that were in the process of taking over Harvard University, looked at Prussia and said, hey, we should try something like that here. They ended up selecting an individual by the name of Horace Mann. He was a legislator and an attorney in Massachusetts who rejected Christianity, who rejected the concepts of individual liberty that come along with Christianity, and really admired the system that the Prussians had built. So he tried to recreate that in Massachusetts. He got himself appointed as the first ever Secretary of Education for any state, right? No state prior to this had had a Secretary of Education or a Department of Education. That was not seen as something that was within the purview of a state government. It just was a radical idea. But he started building this government education system in Massachusetts, modeled on the Prussian system. He even created state normal schools where they were going to train teachers to go out and then teach the children in these newly established public schools that Horace Mann was bringing into Massachusetts. Right away, he went to war with private schools. He was denigrating them, arguing that it was a bad idea for parents to rely on private schools, that everybody should go to these public schools. He wrote extensively on all of this. He was very much a collectivist. He believed that public education would, in his words, equalize all men. And you know, equality under the law is one thing. Equality in the sense that Horace Mann envisioned it is quite another. You cannot have an equal society and also a free society. If everyone is equal in terms of outcomes, in terms of wealth, you literally have a slave state, because you cannot be free and equal. You cannot be equal and free. He did not mean equality under the law. He meant equality in the sense that everybody knows the same thing. Everybody gets the same starting point. You know, there's no incentive for parents to do something special for their children, to give them a leg up. And of course, this is a slavish mentality. After he was finished creating this system, this abominable system in Massachusetts, and it was a disaster right from the start. Right away, the quackery invaded the classrooms. Horace Mann was a major advocate of phrenology, this kook idea that the shape of your skull determines your personality and attributes of your character and things. Totally discredited now. He was also a big-time advocate of the whole word method of teaching reading, which produced an unmitigated disaster in the schools of Boston. Fortunately, that was caught quickly, and we didn't hear about it again for another 50 years. And so that's what Horace Mann did. After he was done in Massachusetts, he went around the country like a traveling evangelist, telling everybody the good news that the government should educate children. And so he went and he testified in legislatures and encouraged them to set up their own government school systems. And by around 1900, most of the states had actually established government school systems, and many of them had passed compulsory education laws. After the Civil War, a lot of the northern states really lobbied hard in the southern states for the southern states to create these government school systems. And so by the turn of the century, government education was beginning to become very entrenched in America. That's when another communist came on the scene, John Dewey. Now, anybody who's gotten an education degree anywhere in the world for the last probably 80 years knows all about John Dewey. At least they know the officially approved version of John Dewey. They probably don't know the truth about John Dewey. He's painted as this superhero who created, the architect of the public education system, the founding father of progressive education. Many teachers today who've been brainwashed with this nonsense in government schools believe that it's because of John Dewey that Americans are educated at all. Of course, they have no concept, they have no understanding of the incredible level of education that we had prior to the advent of government schooling. Now, my assertion that John Dewey is a communist that's not my opinion. That's not me being inflammatory. That is a fact. It's a documented fact. Whether he was a member of the Communist Party or not, we don't know, but we know from his writings what he believed. Unlike Horace Mann, who went to Prussia for his inspiration, John Dewey actually went to the Soviet Union. We know because he wrote these incredibly ridiculous essays. I mean, you look back on them and you think, how could somebody have been so either naive or insane or evil, because he wrote about the Soviet Union in these glowing terms. But there's just this wonderful utopia that Americans should strive to emulate. He was especially pleased with the way their public education system was instilling what he described as a collectivistic mentality in the children. No word about the shortages, the slaughter, the persecution of dissidents. None of that made it into these silly essays that he wrote for American publications. But he very much wanted that in America. He publicly referred to his inspiration as a novel that was published in America in 1888 by Edward Bellamy, another socialist. It was a fiction novel about a communist America in the year 2000, where basically everybody would give up their private property and we'd all be one big happy kumbaya communist family. Now, John Dewey was also a self-proclaimed religious man, not religious in the sense that normal people would understand, but he described himself as a religious humanist. He was one of the co-authors of the Humanist Manifesto. There's a couple dozen signers of this atrocity, and I encourage everybody to read it, because rather than just listening to me talk about it, just go read this thing. It is essentially warmed over communism, masquerading as a religion. The very first point is word for word: we religious humanists believe the universe is self-existing and not created, which of course is a total contradiction of the first words in the Bible. In the beginning, God created. It's also a total contradiction of the viewpoint of the founding fathers. Our founding fathers believed it was a self-evident truth that we were created and that God had given us rights. And so our system of government is completely incompatible with the religion of John Dewey. But John Dewey was very clear about his religion. If you read on in his Humanist Manifesto, he wanted to abolish the profit motive. He wanted to collectivize the means of production, get rid of the capitalist system. So he was a communist in the truest sense of the term, and he recognized that to accomplish these diabolical aims, brainwashing America's youth would be absolutely essential. And so that's why he got to work in the public school system. His nefarious influence today is in every nook and cranny of the schools. He was the lifetime honorary chairman, or president, excuse me, of the National Education Association, the Communist Teachers Union. His disciples are the ones who continue to run the education system to this day. And I'm just about out of time, so I'll leave our little communist history lesson on the education system in America there for now. Obviously, they couldn't do it all at once. One of the things that John Dewey wrote in one of his essays, it was called The Primary Education Fetish. Such an important essay that we actually republished it in the appendix to this book, Crimes of the Educators. He says change must come gradually. To force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction. So he understood if they moved too quickly with this diabolical agenda, they would be tarred and feathered. They'd never get away with it. And so that's why it took them multiple generations to get us where we are now. But John Dewey would have been, I think, very pleased with what the public education system has become, which is basically a factory for little Marxists who want to burn down America and rebuild it in the mold of the Soviet Union. And I'll leave it there. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, now we're going to go to our next speaker, Lilia Slavova. She emigrated from Bulgaria at the height of the Cold War in 1986. She was accompanied then by her soon-to-be husband, a former member of the Communist Party who had become disillusioned with communist rule and defected. She has worked as a teacher for more than 10 years in DC, Maryland, Virginia, and Florida. She is very active in theater as an award-winning actress, director, choreographer, producer, and published playwright. And so Lilia is going to talk to us tonight about what she sees in U.S. education and how it compares and contrasts with education in communist Bulgaria. Lilia, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for being part of it. Why am I actually speaking now? Because first of all, I am a perfect child of socialism. I was born right after the socialism was established in my country, and I spent 30 years of my life through all my education to my master's degree in socialistic Bulgaria. And without the word of speaking English, came in this country and somehow managed to do what I do, continue to be an actress. I have master's degree in acting, but somehow fate brought me to the educational system of Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, and Maryland through a huge grant, which I won because of my teaching methods using theater techniques to help with kids in our educational system to pass their SOLs, basically in social study, later on in geography, even in, believe it or not, in math. But that's why I think I have some kind of knowledge about the system. I'm going to go and start with something about a little bit about Bulgaria and our educational system during socialism as a basic. First of all, I just checked Bulgaria, which is around 7.5 million people, have 98.39% educated people. It's one of the most educated countries in the world, believe it or not, which kind of, when I was checking today, I was like, oh my God, we're still very educated people, I guess. No, but what happened is that we were a kingdom before the communism came. We're a monarchy. We had people, and my teachers, because I was actually studied right after the communism was established, pretty much less than 7 years, and all my teachers were people that were was study in France, in Italy, in Germany, that we actually had one of the best socialistic systems in the whole entire world when it comes to education. Why? What they wanted to do, the education under the communist regime after 1944 actually was modeled after the Soviet Union, but we had a better base. We were a more educated country to start with. And what they had to do really indoctrinate all of us into the socialistic vision, including the teachers. Poor teachers, they were 40, 50 years old people who had to change completely their views of life because in order not to lose their work, they really had to, and not to go to jail and not to go to labor camps. They really have to change all the approach of teaching, and they had to make sure that we, through propaganda, through brainwashing, through really a lot of interesting methods to make us believe in the socialistic system. I would say, honestly, the system did work. We were brainwashed. Somehow, I am including myself too, even though my grandfather was in labor camp, my father was in jail. Those are people that were against the system. We had no future of anything being part of the Communist Party because we were already prosecuted family. But I had to recite my poems in school, and I was very enthusiastic of it. And I believe in the system. I believe the system because their teaching was very persuasive. But luckily, because my parents were very smart people and incredibly educated, my father, who was born 1905, already when communism came, he had 2 degrees. One is in engineering, the other in economy. My mother, born a few years later, she had a degree in law. Later, she had a degree in philosophy. That those people really made sure that I am not completely sucked into this system, and I had my independent thinking, and that's what made me actually defect. The same with my sister who defected. But how were we brainwashed? What were we told? Of course, the first thing to be told how, imperialism and capitalism was really good, awful for us. And really what is in my kind of recollection was that the capitalism must be suppressed even in the human consciousness. That's what really was the slogan. And it did work. It worked for whole generations. And what I see here now, I will jump into what they were establishing in us. They were establishing, first of all, fear. The teachers were fearful of the system, of the government. All the schools were government schools. There were no private schools during socialism. The teachers, young or old, were afraid of the system. They were afraid of labor camp. They were afraid of jail. They were afraid of prosecution. That fear was then, of course, applied to us. We were afraid not to say anything. People like me, that their parents were talking against the system at home. I was afraid to talk in school. My sister and I, we really had to be very quiet about it's, you know, what my parents are talking. My father was a friend with the Tsar. He he established one of the Tsar's called Brannik, the systems for the yachts, and that's why he was prosecuted. We were not allowed to talk about it. And also, the kids of the Communist Party members were the ones that they could do anything they wanted. The parents of those kids had power, and their grades could be better. Their, privileges could be bigger. They can go to better universities. They don't have to take certain exams because they're kids of the party members. Yes, during the socialism, everything was free for us, which was good, great. The government paid for everything. We had free education from preschool to the higher, to colleges, universities, including medical care. Excellent things. But what it did to us through this propaganda, it's that really did not let us to think individually. They really made us to, they formulated our answers. We're talking in phrases. We did not, of course, we didn't have religion freedom. We could not even wear our crest. We are all Christians born. We are baptized secretly by by our parents. This was completely not allowed in our school. Religion was the opium for the masses. That's what we were told. Now, when we were in school, besides the slogans that we hear all the time, and the lozungs that were I don't know if I'm translating the word right, but all the phrases that we had to praise our party, our government, our system were so much in my head up to today. I still think in phrases. And why am I mentioning those things? Because once I started teaching into one of the best school systems in this country, Fairfax, and the best private schools I taught in Knightsmith, I taught some of the kids in Flint Hill, and so many more. I figured out that this actually does exist in our system, besides the fact that for 10 years I was teaching in the public schools. Teaching through fear, it's not a great idea. And the teachers themselves fear the system. The parents were not involved in the system the same way our parents were not involved in the system. They kind of let the government do whatever they want with us, because if they interfere, they would not agree with what our government was doing. Of course, obviously, especially my parents, and they kind of threw me in the system, right? Well, the same here. Through all the 10 years I've been, very actively teaching in the system, I barely saw any parents. Or if they came, the entitled ones wanted what they wanted, but most of the other parents were so disattached from their children. It's like, here, we believe you. And they didn't even know what we were teaching, actually. Not me particularly, because my program was a little bit different, a lot more entertaining and very successful. I can brag about why I get $1 million of grant money from Congress because of my methods. But my point is that what the comparisons I saw is the propaganda in school, teaching by phrases, brainwashing the kids, the social emotional learning. I'm not very agree with that. This equality that they're trying to establish here kind of reminds me back of what we had to, all the phrases we had to hear about the equality, and not be different and not express yourself. And those are things that really bothered me in the system, including the fact that I had 3 of my own kids into the system. And I kind of was a little rebellious. My kids felt it. They felt that I was rebellious even here through the system, and I disagree. My kids went they went for a certain time in private schools, but mostly I believed in the public system, and I didn't have the money to go to private schools. I questioned a lot of the methods here, and I was not afraid. But that's in my own, of course, upbringing, I guess, to be rebellious. And I was not satisfied with the answers I got. Why my kids had to think and not express what they think. If they don't like that author, they should not read the whole entire thing. Or, I mean, I'm giving you maybe stupid examples, but speaking of authors and books, that what we were forbidden to read and forbidden to be educated kind of reminds me of what's happening now in the systems in our public schools here. Even now that I moved to Florida, I talk to the parents and I talk to the kids. Books that we used to read, and even in socialistic countries that are forbidden to be read because of some political issues in it. This political correctness, it's too much for me. Now I have 4 grandchildren in the system also. That political correctness, which was our political correctness back into my socialistic life, right? I pretty much will finish with this. Fear, bullying, it's something there was a lot of bullying in my schools. Teachers were bullying students, parents were bullying teachers. This is really incredibly applicable here to our system. I've seen horrible incidents of parents bullying educators and educators bullying children here. And lack of respect, which is something that I would like to finish with it. We had the reason to not respect our system because our parents, the right parents, were telling us that's what they're teaching, it's not right. But here, I don't understand the lack of the respect to the teachers. It's just unbelievable. And that, it's in our public schools, and it's tremendous. And it has to be eliminated. Because if we don't have the respect for the teachers, or they don't have the respect to the students, I mean, the education really, it's going down the drain. And with that, I will be happy to answer more questions after that.
Okay, thank you, Lilia. Before we get to questions and answers, I have a few announcements. The first is the Anti-Communism Action Team has a website. We invite you to take a look. And we have a weekly roundup of news. So our title this week is China Wins Gold in Tyranny, Oppression, and Genocide. It's a weekly news roundup. And there is a free mailing list available for that. Hit reply mail on your event announcement, and we will sign you up for the mailing list. Your contact information is never sold or shared. The next thing I want to show you is, let's see, where did this one go? Alex's book is called Crimes of the Educators, and that's the cover of it. There's another book I want to show you. This one is called Credentialed to Destroy by Robin Eubanks, and it picks up the story where Alex left off. It starts with John Dewey taking his theories developing his theories, shipping them to the Soviet Union, which adopted them, and then the Soviet Union embellished them, developed them, and sent them back in the 1970s. It's something called the Turchenko Report, which is notable for 2 things that are relevant still today. One is it advocated a lot of computer learning, and the reason it did that was so that it would free up teachers and give them the time for psychological manipulation of the students. So these things are in schools. There's a lot of computer learning in schools, and there's a lot of psychological manipulation going on in the government schools now. So there's a direct line from the Turchenko report of the Soviet Union to social and emotional learning, SEL, here in government schools today. So I wanted to bring that book to your attention because it picks up where Alex left off. Now, let's see. The last thing I want to show you is there is a video that we did. So let me try to get to it this way. Okay, what I wanted to show you was a video we did back in 2017 called Producing Auto Warm Beers. And Alex is in this video. And it is our contention, my contention in the video, that the way Otto Warmbier was taught and the classes that he chose at UVA, the University of Virginia, caused a lack of awareness of the danger of going to communist countries. So I think he went to Cuba, I think he went to China, and of course we know what happened to him in North Korea. So that video is about 45 minutes long, and it's also on YouTube. So I wanted to bring that to your attention. Now, the next thing I want to tell you is that I will have a special announcement at the end. We're creating something new here. But before I get to that announcement, let's go to Q&A. Let's see what's in the chat. So all right, I'm not seeing any questions. So I'm going to ask the first one. My first question will go to, first two questions are for Alex. Alex, where can people buy your book?
Thank you, Chris. There's a number of places. Amazon sells it cheaper than I can, which is a shame, but people can get it from Amazon for $17 shipped overnight, which is pretty incredible. You can get it from at my website, libertysentinel.org, for 20 plus shipping, and then you can get it at all the regular bookstores, Barnes and Noble, Books A Million, a lot of the smaller Christian bookstores and stuff carry it as well. Also, you can get it as an audiobook through Amazon and Audible. And I have done a very extensive series in the Epoch Times going through all of this history and much more. And that is hopefully going to be turned into a book later this year, published by the Epoch Times, their book publishing division. And most of those pieces are free to read, even to non-subscribers. Some of them are behind a paywall for premium members, but a lot of that history is in there as well. So if people want to find it, they can get it there too.
Okay, thank you. My next question for you is, you mentioned CRT, critical race theory. Does that have communist origins, and if so, what are they?
It absolutely does. It is essentially just a reframed version of Karl Marx's theory of class conflict. Marx understood that in order to be able to advance this diabolical agenda, he was going to have to create different factions. So he had to have the oppressor and the oppressed. Now, in his view of the world, it was a class issue. You had the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie, of course, were the oppressors, the business owners, the capitalists, and so on, while the oppressed were the working class, the proletariat. And this is what every communist government did. This is what all the communist revolutionaries did, was try to escalate this sense of class consciousness, that you're a member of the oppressed, and so you have to join the revolution to throw off your oppressors, or you're one of the oppressors and you better hurry up and renounce your privilege and get over to the right side and help us tear down everything that exists, or you're going to be murdered. So when they tried to market this in the United States, it just wasn't that appealing, right? Even 100 years ago, to try to tell a working class American that he was being oppressed, really, it was ludicrous. Working class Americans 100 years ago were richer than people had been any time in human history, any place in the world. It was not a useful selling point. So the communists came up with this idea of making the conflict along racial lines. In fact, we've got evidence that the Comintern explored this idea literally a century ago. Stalin was big into this, Lenin was big into this, and so they figured out that for the American context, they would need to reframe the oppressor-oppressed in terms of racial conflict, so that you had anybody who was a descendant of Europeans was automatically part of the oppressor class. Anybody who was a descendant of non-Europeans was part of the oppressed class. Now they've added to that. Critical race theory is not the end-all and be-all. They now, for example, they terrorize the little kindergarten, first grade, second grade students, and they tell them, well, if you're white, you're automatically an oppressor. But there are options. If you maybe feel like a homosexual, or if you feel like you might have been born into the wrong body and you're a transgender, that would put you into the oppressed class. So you don't have to be, one of the mean oppressors. So, but this absolutely comes straight out of the communist idea. The goal is not to pursue racial justice, like the communists used to say back in the 1960s with Students for a Democratic Society. The issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution. They're not interested in racial justice. They're not interested in climate justice. They're interested in communist revolution. And critical race theory is a tool to advance that agenda.
Okay, let me add to that by saying critical race theory is derived from critical legal studies. So critical race theory was spun by a group of law school professors who were coming out of a critical legal studies. They got critical legal studies back from critical studies, critical theory, which goes back to the Frankfurt School, the group of communists who came over from Nazi Germany and settled themselves at Columbia University. And they devised a theory that let's criticize everything and tear everything down, which is basically that in a nutshell. So critical theory has a pedigree that definitely goes back to the Frankfurt School, which were a bunch of communists, and Antonio Gramsci with the Long March of cultural Marxism through the institutions. The next question goes to Lilia out of the chat. Lilia, what books were banned in Fairfax County schools? What books are banned in Fairfax County schools?
I really don't know now, but they were talking about, now I can't even think of now. You got me off guard. Kind of the classics. They were, and they were not that they were banned. They were talking about banning them. There were protests. Okay, starting from Steinbeck, and of course because Steinbeck, Hemingway, Uncle Tom, even he, that book was under fire. And I really don't know if that was because I did not teach literature there. Those were the times when they were talking about it. There was a whole list of books. And funny enough, most of those books actually made it to the, obviously for obvious reasons, made it to Europe, and they were forbidden here. Well, we still talk about Steinbeck and Hemingway. I know they were with communists they did and socialists they did, but they were great authors, and I don't understand why this censorship that happened while I was there for 10 years, and they were talking about cutting those books out of the reading logs of the kids. I was in shock. I said, guys, this is literature. I mean, let them, let them even read Marx. Maybe if they read Marx, they'll understand that should never happen here. They say, start to know your enemy in order to fight the enemy, right? Something that I personally try to teach my students.
I think it was Ronald Reagan who said a communist is somebody who's read Marx, and anti-communist is somebody who understands Marx. No,
exactly. That's my point. That's exactly what my point is. If you understand what's really happening there, if you understand that you obviously become anti-Marxist.
Next question goes.
Yes.
The title of the program is "What Can We Do About All This?" So I'm going to throw that question first to Lilia and then to Alex. So Lilia, what is to be done, to borrow a phrase?
Oh, honestly, this is a big country, and it's such a difficult to control. Every state has their priorities of politics. I have no formula for this. As I said, my formula simply is stay away from something that was proven it doesn't work. Our systems prove that this socialistic approach does not work. And the kids, if you remember, we were talking to the students of one of the universities of California when I was giving them an example what socialism really meant in real time with us. Oh my God, I don't know how to give more advice than just stay away from something that's proven that doesn't work.
Okay, Alex, what can we do?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I would say by far the most simple, urgent, and immediate solution is for parents to get their children. And yeah, I've heard all the objections. I could go through them one by one, but parents, if you have children in this disgusting system, you need to get them out immediately. They're destroying your children mentally, physically, morally, spiritually, academically. You don't have to believe me. The government will tell you, right? Their own tests show that less than 1/3 of victims of public schools are proficient in any subject. If you look at the data on the religion side of things, children from Christian homes, if they go through 12 years of this government indoctrination, more than 80% of them will leave their church, will leave their faith, and they'll become little humanists, just like John Dewey would have wanted. So if you're a Christian, that's essentially like playing Russian roulette with your children, except you've got 5 rounds in the chambers instead of 1. So I think, obviously, Immediately, you need to get your children out. If you have grandchildren, you should encourage your children to pull them out. And then once you're there, you can homeschool, you can put them into a Christian school. There are a lot of options. But, I tell people you need to think of the public school building like it's on fire. And if your children are inside, you don't sit around debating what to do. You don't think about whether you ought to run for the school board. You don't go yell at your state legislator because you want CRT banned. You run in the building, you grab your child, and then you worry about, what do we do about the fire and how do we deal with these things? So I know that sounds harsh, but and I know all the objections. The Christians will say, well, my kids need to be salt and light. Your kids are not going to be salt and light. They're being discipled by people who hate you, who hate your faith, who hate your country, who hate your Constitution. And, if you would send your 8-year-old to Iraq with an AR-15 or an M16, then you can talk to me about sending your children into this spiritual war that's going on in the classrooms. Otherwise, I think it's a terrible argument. The idea that, we don't want to abandon the schools because then all the other kids are going to be dumbed down and brainwashed. Well, yeah, we need to get as many of them out as we can. I think we're winning this battle. I think among conservatives and Christians, the cat is out of the bag, so to speak. I do not believe these public schools can be reformed. So, once you're done with the immediate issue of protecting your own children from these atrocities, on a more systemic level, we need to not reform the system, because if I told you needed to reform your cancer, you'd look at me like I was crazy, right? The public school system in this country is a cancer. It is destroying not just the children, but the country itself. And trying to reform a cancer is a fool's errand. We all recognize socialism and communism are bad. We all recognize that having the government run our grocery store would be insane. We all recognize that the argument that, well, there are some poor people who can't afford to pay for their own groceries. We all recognize that if you try to use that as an argument to have the government run the grocery stores, that would still be insane. We all understand that markets and free markets produce the most efficient use of resources, the biggest variety, the most choices, the highest quality. We understand this when it comes to farming. We understand this when it comes to grocery stores. We understand this when it comes to automobiles, but somehow we don't understand it when it comes to education. We need to completely abolish the government school system and move toward a privately controlled free market in schools where churches, parents, nonprofit foundations, charities, and communal associations handle the bulk of education. And rather than a wall of separation between church and state as the liberals use it, I think we need a wall of separation between school and state. The government should not be educating children. It was a mistake from the beginning. And so I think on a systemic level, we need to get the government completely out of education. I know that's a long-term goal, but as far as solutions go, I think that's the only one, Chris.
Alex, you tell a great story about somebody who was Secretary of Education. I think it was in Arizona. And she was a conservative. She started with the idea that she was going to reform the entire system. By the time her 4 years was up, she had concluded that she had been blocked so many times and stuff had happened and twisted. And you can tell the story, Alex. But
happy to. Thank you, Chris. So I don't know if Chris mentioned, I'm the executive director of Public School Exit. It's a nonprofit organization. Our goal is to start a mass exodus from the public schools. We think that's already started. One of the members of our board was the superintendent of public instruction for the state of Arizona. Basically, the Secretary of Education is what they call it there for the state of Arizona. And she served in every position. She was on the school board. She was president of the school board. She worked in every educational position until she finally got all the way to the very top. Her goal was to try to improve this. She wanted to get Common Core out. She wanted to get phonics taught. She wanted to get the sex ed and the communism out of the classroom. And what she realized after 4 years of this is that it is futile. So she has now joined our board of directors. She's done a number of interviews with me. You can go watch those. And we hear this every day. I've helped a lot of people get onto school boards. I've advised a lot of state school board members, local school board members. The issue is, and there's, I think, a real naivete among conservatives that if we could just take over the school board, everything's going to be fine. And what's not being understood here is that the system we're dealing with no longer is controlled by the local school board, if it ever was. We're dealing with a hydra here. And you could cut off multiple tentacles from a hydra, and they'll just grow right back, and the rest of the tentacles will still swallow the prey. So you could chop off the unions, and you could chop off the Federal Department of Education. You could even get rid of UNESCO at the United Nations, and you'd still have the entire system operating just as it was before. So the entire system needs to be abandoned and then dismantled. Just chopping at the branches of it is not actually going to do any good. And I could give you an endless parade of people who've tried to work in the system. I can show you communities where the entire school board was run by Christian conservatives. The chairman of the Education Commission, or the Assembly Education Committee in California, the only conservative who chaired that committee in the last 60 years. His name is Steve Baldwin. He was the former executive director of the Council for National Policy. He is now on our board as well. And he'll tell you the same thing. He got 50 conservatives elected to school boards. They took over entire school boards while he was the chairman of the Education Committee in the California Assembly. They got some great legislation passed. It did not do one iota of good because, again, you're trying to reform your cancer. You don't want to reform the cancer. You want to get rid of it. And I think that's how we need to see this monstrosity.
Okay. Alex, there's a couple comments in the chat you might be interested in. One gets to the idea of what percentage of the population can we really expect to homeschool, and the other worries about whether or not there's communist infiltration now in homeschooling curriculums. But we're almost out of time, so I'm gonna put the last two questions to Lilia. And the first question, Lilia, is what other tools besides CRT, are communists using to advance the revolution in the United States today? What do you see based on your experience in Bulgaria?
Well, that critical thinking which you guys are talking about is exactly what I see is the big issue, and this racial injustice. It's something that it's exactly what you said. This is one of the things. Well, there's so many things, guys. It's even hard to. I'm so involved into it that I just become angry. I'm an emotional actress. What can I say? But repeat the question again, that I can put my mind more specific, please.
Sure. Let me combine these two questions. What methods are communists using in the United States today, trying to take over, and what is the overall purpose of it? What do you think their overall purpose is?
Well, I don't know if they really want to uneducate. I would say what the goal of the socialists, the first goal for them was to make everybody educated enough to read their propaganda. Right now, it's such a disarray of our educational system of America that I have the feeling, and I talk to teachers, I have the feeling that they're trying to de-educate kids. I mean, kids that even have from the home education, they're trying to, there's certain things in even math. There's so simple things in math. I cannot help my granddaughter, and I come from engineering, parent engineer. I can't help her to fix the problem because they made it so complicated that actually the kid cannot put three numbers together. This is actually anti-education. They made the thing so complicated. And I think behind it's money. Those people that create those programs, they get so much money. I think it's greed for that. I mean, maybe it's my own opinion, but it's not my own because I talk to the teachers. It's constantly rebuilding new and new programs, and they give the government. Alex is right. The government. I'm not agree on everything that has to be. Sorry, Alex, I have to disagree. I think it's impossible, at least for the next 100 years, to have the education without the government. But the government is pouring so much money in so many directions that is not challenged. And this is exactly what happened in the socialistic system. Money were poured in education, okay, so much with one goal, right? Actually, to make the masses believe what they were told.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you, Lilia. Thank you, Alex. I promised you all a special announcement. Our time is up, so I'm going to be very quick. I want to let you all know that my organization is starting a teachers network The goal is to get like-minded teachers networked so that they discover more ways to get more mind share for the political right in the classroom. I'm able to do this because I've hired an assistant with the generosity of some donors. And so our first task is to start up a newsletter. If you're a teacher or you have friends who are teachers, please get in touch and we'll put you on the mailing list for the newsletter, and the project will grow from there. With that, that's the end of the formal agenda. I want to thank everybody for being here, and now we go into an informal session. Lily, I hope you can stick around a bit. Alex said he has to go in a little while, but hopefully he can stay around for a few minutes. And now we're going to open up the floor, and I invite you to speak. Who has the first question or comment?
Well, one that comes to mind right off the top of my head, and I'd probably be better off asking my wife and kids this question because my wife handles the bulk of the homeschooling here, but one series of books that my older children have absolutely loved that very, very clearly articulates the principles of freedom and exposes the flaws in communistic, socialistic thinking is the Tuttle Twins. They're written for children. A lot of them distill complex ideas. You know, there's one on, for example, Frederick Bastiat's The Law. There's one dealing with the ideals of Ayn Rand. There's a lot of these like this, and they're kind of simplified and made fun and cartoonish for children, but they're excellent. Again, the name is Tuttle Twins, Tuttle Twins, and I can tell you my boys love them. And they're very affordable, and they're very good at distilling these principles. You know, I don't know what age group they're designed for. My two oldest boys, they're 11 and 9. They just absolutely adore them. So, you know, if you're in a government school, they may not be able to read them at all because, of course, they're learning how to read wrong. But, you know, homeschool children or children who learn how to read properly, I think from 8 and up, they could easily read it.
Okay. This is not for children, but I want to let you know about a list of resources that we put together. I have to update it because there's a movie that's come out, but resources on communism for young people, books like 1984, Animal Farm, those are indispensable. Movie, actually it's a movie now, First They Killed My Father. Another movie, which is a kind of a fun movie where the Soviets come and take over a U.S. high school. That's called Red Dawn. Red Dawn. That's a lot of fun. And then I need to update this more because I came across something. Somebody gave me a graphic novel, which is a fancy name for comic book, and it was Ayn Rand's Anthem, done in a graphic novel form, and I thought that was quite good, and that would be very appealing for younger readers. Who has the next comment or question? Go, Mary.
I'd like to come back to, is communism infiltrating into the homeschooling now that so many people are leaving the public schools?
Absolutely. Communism tries to infiltrate everything, and so we see more and more subversive influence within homeschool publishing resources. We see the same thing happening in Christian schools. There are many now Christian schools, I call them Christian in name only, that are just as woke as the government indoctrination centers. They're pushing critical race theory. They're pushing all of this, and then parents think they'll pay $40,000 because they say a prayer before class and that everything's going to be fine. So I tell people, you know, just because you're paying a lot of money for a fancy private school or for homeschooling is not going to insulate you from that. You need to do your due diligence in selecting your materials and you know, making sure that your children are trained to understand this and to think about it. You know, I try to make sure, for example, that my children are more familiar with the communist arguments than communists themselves would be, because you know, that would help them to address this when they inevitably confront it. But yes, absolutely, that subversive influence is coming into the homeschool community, and unfortunately, it's everywhere.
So, Chris, are there opportunities that you've got on your website and with all of this information you've already collected to have keywords that parents could look for when they go out and do research on the homeschooling opportunities that they find?
There's nothing on my website like that, and that would be a huge project. and maybe that's something Alex has taken on or would like to take on.
There is a lady who does reviews of homeschool materials. Her name is Kathy Duffy, and I know her. She does a very good job. We've been collaborating with her through Public School Exit, and you know, I would consider her recommendations to be very, very useful and well informed. And she's got a tremendous archive of resources that she has reviewed. And unfortunately, folks, that's all I have time for today. But I want to thank everybody for staying, and thank you for listening, and thank you, Chris, for putting this on, and thank you, Lilia. Even if we don't agree on everything, I very much appreciate hearing your opinion. Thank you for sharing, and yeah, thanks again, everybody. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Alex. So long. Thank everybody else for being here, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.